In the shadowed corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio, where whispered words could topple kingdoms and careless utterances could doom entire bloodlines, Niccolò Machiavelli understood a truth that modern society has forgotten: the tongue is the most dangerous weapon in human arsenal, precisely because it feels so harmless. 5 centuries after his quill scratched across parchment in his modest study outside Florence, his observations about the fatal moments when speech becomes self-sabotage remain as cutting as a Medici blade. The art of strategic silence and calculated speech was not merely political theory for Machiavelli, it was survival. In Renaissance Italy, where city-states rose and fell on the strength of alliances forged in private chambers and broken by public declarations, he witnessed firsthand how a single misplaced word could unravel years of careful planning. Today, in boardrooms and bedrooms, in courtrooms and coffee shops, the same fatal patterns repeat with clockwork precision. The stakes may have changed, but the consequences remain devastatingly real. What follows is an examination of 10 critical moments when the unbridled tongue becomes its own worst enemy, drawn from centuries of human folly and illuminated by Machiavellian wisdom. These are not merely cautionary tales, but surgical dissections of the precise moments when speech transforms from tool to trap. Part 1: The Weapons of Words. The moment of premature victory. In the autumn of 1502, Cesare Borgia stood at the pinnacle of his power, his armies having swept through the Romagna with devastating efficiency. Yet it was not on the battlefield that his fortunes began to turn, but in the drawing rooms where he celebrated too early and too loudly. The young duke, intoxicated by success, began speaking of his future conquests as certainties, revealing strategies that should have remained locked in his mind like state secrets. This phenomenon, the compulsive need to declare victory before the war is won, remains one of the most persistent forms of linguistic self-destruction. In modern corporate environments, executives routinely sabotage pending deals by prematurely announcing acquisitions, sending stock prices tumbling, and alerting competitors to defensive strategies. The pattern is so predictable it might be mathematical: confidence plus premature disclosure equals strategic vulnerability. The tongue, when loosened by success, becomes a liability of extraordinary proportions. Consider the technology entrepreneur who, riding high on preliminary funding discussions, casually mentioned to a journalist that their startup would definitely close a Series A round within weeks. The potential investors, reading the interview, interpreted the certainty as desperation disguised as confidence. They withdrew, leaving the entrepreneur scrambling to explain to employees why promised hiring was suddenly, indefinitely postponed. Machiavelli observed that fortune favors those who match their actions to the times, but he might have added that misfortune favors those who speak of the future as if it were the past. The moment when success seems assured is precisely when the tongue becomes most dangerous, because success creates the illusion that consequences no longer apply. In boardrooms across Silicon Valley, in political campaign headquarters, in sports locker rooms after strong seasons, the same scene replays endlessly: confident leaders declaring premature victory, only to watch their words become anchors that drag them toward defeat. The psychological mechanism underlying this self-sabotage is complex but predictable. Success generates dopamine, which impairs judgment while simultaneously increasing confidence in that impaired judgment. The result is a chemical conspiracy against discretion. Leaders begin to see themselves as prophets of their own success rather than architects who must continue building until the foundation is truly secure. In the pharmaceutical industry, this pattern reaches almost absurd proportions. Research teams, excited by promising early trial results, speak too freely at conferences about drugs that are years from approval. Competitors take notes, investors adjust expectations, and regulatory agencies scrutinize claims that were never meant to be promises. The tongue transforms hope into liability, possibility into obligation. The moment of defensive revelation. Perhaps no linguistic trap is more insidious than the defensive revelation, that moment when, feeling cornered or criticized, individuals volunteer information that transforms minor vulnerabilities into major exposures. Machiavelli witnessed this repeatedly in diplomatic negotiations, where ambassadors, stung by accusations, would refute claims by providing details that revealed far more damaging truths. The anatomy of defensive revelation follows a predictable pattern. First comes the accusation or criticism, usually minor or tangential. Then arrives the emotional response: indignation, hurt, or anger. Finally, the tongue launches into a defense that not only addresses the original criticism but provides additional information that creates new vulnerabilities. It is as if, in attempting to close one door, the defender throws open several windows. In legal proceedings, this phenomenon reaches almost artistic levels of self-destruction. Witnesses, feeling their credibility questioned, volunteer details that prosecutors never thought to request. A defendant accused of a minor financial irregularity, stung by the implication of dishonesty, launches into a detailed explanation of their accounting practices that reveals a pattern of much more serious violations. The original charge becomes merely the appetizer for a feast of self-incrimination. The corporate world offers equally stark examples. A CEO, criticized in the financial press for a single questionable decision, calls an impromptu press conference to defend their judgment. In the process of explaining the rationale behind the criticized decision, they reveal a systematic pattern of similar choices that transforms a one-time mistake into evidence of poor judgment. The stock price, which might have weathered the original criticism, plummets in response to the unexpected transparency. This trap is particularly vicious because it exploits one of humanity's most admirable impulses, the desire to be understood. When people feel misunderstood or unfairly characterized, the natural response is to provide more information, to add context, to explain the nuances that critics have missed. Yet in many situations, this impulse toward comprehensive explanation becomes a form of strategic suicide. The technology sector provides a masterclass in defensive revelation. When privacy advocates criticized a major social media platform for collecting user data, the company's response was to publish a detailed white paper explaining exactly what data they collected, how they processed it, and what insights they derived from it. The defense was technically accurate and well-intentioned, but it revealed capabilities that privacy advocates had never suspected, transforming a narrow criticism into a comprehensive indictment of surveillance capitalism. Machiavelli understood that in conflicts of perception, less information often serves defenders better than more. The tongue, when motivated by wounded pride or a desire for vindication, becomes an enemy of discretion. It volunteers details that were never requested, provides examples that illuminate patterns better left in shadow, and transforms defensive positions into offensive vulnerabilities. The moment of misplaced trust. The Renaissance courts were laboratories of human nature, and few phenomena fascinated Machiavelli more than the moment when trusted confidants transform into dangerous enemies. He observed repeatedly how individuals, believing they had established unshakable bonds of loyalty, would share secrets that later became weapons in the hands of those they had trusted. The tongue, when guided by misplaced confidence in human loyalty, creates vulnerabilities that can lie dormant for years before exploding with devastating consequences. In modern contexts, this pattern manifests with depressing regularity. Corporate executives share strategic plans with lieutenants who later jump to competitors. Politicians confide in advisors who subsequently write tell-all memoirs. Entrepreneurs discuss proprietary technologies with potential partners who become direct competitors. The common thread is not malice in the initial trust, but rather a fundamental misunderstanding of how circumstances change loyalty. The psychology of misplaced trust is rooted in projection, the assumption that others share our values, loyalties, and constraints. When individuals have built their careers on discretion and loyalty, they often assume these qualities are universal rather than exceptional. They speak freely to others because they themselves would never betray such confidence, failing to recognize that not everyone operates under the same ethical framework. Consider the pharmaceutical executive who, during a casual dinner with a former colleague now working for a competing firm, discussed the unexpected side effects their company had discovered during late-stage trials. The conversation felt natural, two old friends sharing professional challenges over wine. Months later, when the competitor filed patent applications for solutions to those exact side effects, the executive realized that professional friendship had been confused with personal loyalty. The casual conversation had provided a roadmap for competitive advantage. This type of linguistic vulnerability is particularly dangerous because it often involves information shared gradually over time rather than in single, dramatic revelations. A series of seemingly innocent conversations can, when combined, provide a complete picture of strategic plans, competitive weaknesses, or operational challenges. Each individual revelation seems harmless, but the cumulative effect can be devastating. The venture capital world offers perhaps the most sophisticated examples of this phenomenon. Entrepreneurs, building relationships with potential investors, often share detailed information about their business models, customer acquisition strategies, and market insights. They assume that professional ethics and legal obligations create a protective framework around these discussions. Yet these same investors often sit on the boards of competing companies, attend industry conferences where information flows freely, and maintain professional relationships that span multiple potentially competing investments. The tongue, when operating under assumptions of shared loyalty, becomes remarkably generous with information that should be carefully guarded. Individuals begin to view certain conversations as safe spaces where normal discretion can be relaxed. They create mental categories of trusted individuals who are exempt from the usual information security protocols. Yet these categories often persist long after the circumstances that justified them have changed. Machiavelli's insight was that loyalty is contextual rather than permanent. The advisor who is trustworthy when their interests align with yours may become dangerous when circumstances change those interests. The colleague who guards your secrets when you work for the same company may have different obligations after they change employers. The friend who protects your confidences when you are both struggling may view those same confidences differently when one of you achieves success. The moment of emotional flooding in the heat of passion, whether anger, excitement, or desperation, the tongue becomes a runaway horse that no amount of pulling on the reins can stop. Machiavelli observed this phenomenon in countless diplomatic encounters where negotiators, overwhelmed by emotion, would abandon carefully crafted strategies in favor of impulsive declarations that undermine months of preparation. The moment when emotion floods reason is perhaps the most predictable yet least preventable form of linguistic self-sabotage. The neurological basis for this phenomenon is now well understood. Strong emotions literally hijack the brain's executive functions, reducing complex decision-making capabilities to simple fight-or-flight responses. In this state, the tongue operates without oversight from the higher-order thinking processes that normally govern strategic communication. Words pour out as direct expressions of emotional state rather than as calculated tools for achieving specific objectives. Corporate boardrooms provide theaters for this drama on a daily basis. Executives, faced with criticism or challenging questions, experience what psychologists call emotional flooding, a state where rational response gives way to defensive reaction. In this state, they volunteer information that should remain confidential, make promises that exceed their authority, and issue threats that reveal strategic weakness rather than strength. The quarterly earnings call becomes a confessional booth where emotional responses override prepared talking points. The pattern is particularly devastating in legal contexts. Witnesses who maintain composure during prepared testimony often collapse into emotional reactivity during cross-examination. A defendant who has successfully maintained innocence for months may, when confronted with a particularly inflammatory accusation, launch into an explanation that provides prosecutors with previously unknown evidence. The tongue, under emotional pressure, operates without the filter of strategic thinking. Consider the technology CEO who, during a congressional hearing about data privacy, maintained careful composure while discussing general policies and procedures. However, when a senator accused the company of deliberately deceiving users, the CEO's emotional response included specific details about internal discussions that had never been publicly disclosed. The attempt to defend against accusations of deception inadvertently revealed actual deceptions that had not been part of the original investigation. This phenomenon extends beyond high-stakes public forums into everyday professional interactions. Employees, feeling unfairly treated during performance reviews, often respond with emotional outbursts that include admissions of workplace violations they had successfully concealed. Entrepreneurs, frustrated by investor skepticism, sometimes respond by revealing competitive threats or market challenges that undermine the very confidence they were trying to build. The tongue, when guided by emotion rather than strategy, tends toward maximum rather than minimum disclosure. Where calculated speech might reveal just enough information to achieve a specific goal, emotional speech reveals everything available, operating under the assumption that complete truth will somehow resolve the emotional tension. This assumption is usually catastrophically wrong. Machiavelli understood that in politics, and, by extension, in all human interactions where stakes matter, emotion is a luxury that effective leaders cannot afford. The moment when the tongue is governed by feeling rather than thinking is the moment when strategic advantage begins to evaporate. Yet this understanding provides little protection against the biochemical reality of emotional flooding. The most sophisticated practitioners of strategic communication develop what might be called emotional circuit breakers, predetermined stopping points that prevent emotional reactivity from overriding strategic thinking. These might include standard phrases like "I need to consider that question carefully before responding," or "let me get back to you with a complete answer." The goal is not to eliminate emotion, which would be both impossible and unhuman, but rather to create space between emotional impulse and linguistic expression. Part 2. The Anatomy of Self-Destruction. The moment of boastful expertise. The court of Lorenzo de' Medici was filled with individuals eager to demonstrate their value through displays of knowledge and capability. Machiavelli observed how this eagerness often became a form of self-sabotage, as courtiers would volunteer expertise that revealed more about their limitations than their strengths. The modern equivalent of this phenomenon occurs whenever individuals, seeking to establish credibility or authority, speak beyond the boundaries of their actual knowledge, creating vulnerabilities that skilled opponents can exploit with surgical precision. The psychology behind boastful expertise is complex, involving elements of insecurity, competitive pressure, and the fundamental human desire to be valued for our knowledge rather than our ignorance. In professional contexts, this manifests as the impulse to appear expert in areas where we have only surface-level understanding. The tongue, motivated by the desire to impress, begins making claims that invite scrutiny we cannot withstand. In the legal profession, this pattern reaches almost comedic proportions during depositions and expert witness testimony. Attorneys, seeking to establish their clients' credibility, encourage witnesses to speak confidently about technical matters. Yet confidence often extends beyond competence, leading to statements that opposing counsel can systematically demolish through detailed questioning. A witness who claims expertise in financial modeling may find themselves unable to explain basic statistical concepts that underlie their supposed area of mastery. The technology industry provides particularly stark examples of this phenomenon. During product demonstrations and investor pitches, technical founders often make claims about their system's capabilities that sound impressive to non-technical audiences but create enormous vulnerabilities when examined by experts. A startup founder claiming that their artificial intelligence system learns like the human brain may find that statement quoted in patent disputes, regulatory filings, and competitive analyses where the gap between claim and reality becomes embarrassingly obvious. The tongue, when seeking to establish expertise, tends toward superlatives and absolutes that invite challenge. Instead of claiming sufficient knowledge to address specific problems, individuals claim comprehensive mastery of entire domains. Instead of acknowledging the boundaries of their expertise, they speak as if those boundaries do not exist. This linguistic overreach transforms areas of strength into potential weaknesses. Consider the pharmaceutical executive who, during a conference presentation about drug development, claimed that their company's research process eliminated all possible safety risks. The statement was intended to emphasize the thoroughness of their safety protocols, but it created a legal liability when unexpected side effects emerged months later. Regulatory agencies and plaintiff attorneys quoted the executive's words as evidence of negligence or false advertising, transforming a boastful claim into courtroom evidence. The phenomenon extends into academic and intellectual contexts where the stakes might seem lower but the consequences can be equally devastating. Scholars, seeking to establish authority in their fields, sometimes make broad claims about their research that invite detailed scrutiny. A historian claiming to have definitively solved a long-standing historical mystery may find their methodology and sources subjected to intense peer review that reveals flaws they had overlooked in their eagerness to claim certainty. Machiavelli's insight was that true expertise is demonstrated through precision rather than scope. The most effective practitioners of any craft tend to speak about their capabilities in specific, limited terms rather than broad, universal ones. They understand that credibility is built through consistent demonstration of reliable judgment within defined boundaries rather than through claims of unlimited capability. The tongue, when motivated by the desire to appear expert, often betrays actual limitations through overcompensation. Genuine experts tend to speak about their fields with careful qualification, acknowledging uncertainty and complexity. Pretended experts speak with certainty about matters that actual experts know to be uncertain. This difference in linguistic pattern often reveals the gap between claimed and actual competence. In consulting environments, this pattern becomes particularly dangerous because consultants' professional value depends heavily on perceived expertise. The consultant who claims capability across multiple domains may win initial contracts through apparent versatility but face catastrophic professional consequences when actual performance reveals the gap between claimed and actual competence. The tongue's eagerness to establish credibility becomes the mechanism of its destruction. The moment of vindictive truth-telling. Among the most dangerous patterns Machiavelli observed in Renaissance politics was the moment when individuals, feeling wronged or betrayed, would abandon strategic discretion in favor of vengeful revelation. The tongue, when motivated by a desire for retribution, becomes remarkably generous with information that damages not only intended targets but, often, the truth-teller themselves. This phenomenon, vindictive truth-telling, represents one of the most complex forms of linguistic self-sabotage because it involves the weapon of accuracy wielded without regard for consequences. The psychological appeal of vindictive truth-telling is profound. When individuals feel they have been mistreated, lied to, or betrayed, the impulse to set the record straight can become overwhelming. The tongue, operating under the banner of justice and honesty, begins revealing information that was previously protected by discretion, professional obligation, or strategic necessity. Yet this information, while often accurate, creates new vulnerabilities that can be more devastating than the original injury. Corporate environments provide endless examples of this phenomenon. Employees who feel unfairly terminated often speak freely to journalists, competitors, or regulatory agencies about internal practices they had previously kept confidential. Their revelations may be entirely truthful and their grievances entirely justified, yet the act of revelation often damages their own professional prospects more severely than the termination that motivated it. Industry colleagues begin to view them as unreliable guardians of confidential information, making future employment opportunities scarce. The pattern becomes particularly complex in situations involving non-disclosure agreements and professional confidentiality requirements. Individuals convinced that their former employers have acted unethically face the terrible choice between protecting their own interests through continued discretion or serving what they perceive as the greater good through revelation. The tongue, when guided by moral indignation, often chooses revelation without fully calculating the personal costs. Consider the pharmaceutical researcher who discovered that their company was suppressing unfavorable trial data for a major drug. Feeling ethically compelled to protect public safety, they provided detailed information to regulatory agencies and medical journals. The revelations led to important policy changes and potentially saved lives, but they also ended the researcher's career in pharmaceutical development. Future employers, while respecting the researcher's ethical stance, could not risk hiring someone who might make similar revelations about their proprietary information. The technology sector offers perhaps the most dramatic examples of vindictive truth-telling through whistleblowing and leak cultures. Engineers and executives who feel betrayed by their companies often respond by revealing trade secrets, strategic plans, or internal communications to journalists or competitors. Their motives may be genuinely public-spirited, but the professional consequences often extend far beyond their intended targets. The legal profession provides unique insights into this phenomenon because attorneys regularly witness vindictive truth-telling in divorce proceedings, partnership dissolutions, and corporate disputes. Former spouses reveal financial irregularities that damage both parties' reputations. Business partners disclose operational details that undermine the value of shared assets. The desire for retribution overwhelms the recognition that mutual destruction often results from mutual revelation. Machiavelli understood that revenge is a luxury that strategic thinkers cannot afford. The moment when the tongue is motivated by vindictive impulses is the moment when careful distinction between self-interest and justice becomes most important. Yet this distinction is precisely what emotional arousal makes most difficult to maintain. The phenomenon is particularly tragic because vindictive truth-telling often involves individuals whose grievances are legitimate and whose revelations serve important public interests. The pharmaceutical researcher whose career was destroyed by revealing suppressed safety data was objectively serving public health. The technology whistleblower who exposed privacy violations was protecting consumer rights. Yet the personal costs of these revelations often discourage others from similar actions, creating a chilling effect that undermines the very public interests that vindictive truth-telling sometimes serves. The moment of misread social dynamics. The Renaissance court was an intricate web of shifting alliances, hidden rivalries, and unspoken hierarchies that could change overnight based on political developments, family connections, or simply the prince's mood. Machiavelli observed that survival in such environments required not just intelligence but also acute sensitivity to social currents that often ran counter to apparent realities. The moment when individuals misread these dynamics and speak according to their misunderstanding rather than the actual situation represents one of the subtlest yet most devastating forms of self-sabotage. Modern professional environments retain much of this complexity, though the stakes may be careers rather than lives. Corporate hierarchies, academic departments, political organizations, and even social groups operate according to power structures that are rarely explicitly stated but always present. The tongue, when guided by misunderstanding of these structures, can inadvertently violate unspoken rules with consequences that seem disproportionate to the apparent offense. The challenge of reading social dynamics lies partly in their invisibility. Unlike formal organizational charts or written policies, the actual power relationships and informal rules that govern group behavior exist primarily in shared understanding that is never directly articulated. Newcomers to organizations often struggle with this hidden curriculum, making linguistic choices that reveal their outsider status while simultaneously creating barriers to insider acceptance. Consider the newly hired executive who, during their first senior leadership meeting, publicly challenged the CEO's strategic direction based on their previous company experience. The challenge was professionally presented and substantively valid, but it violated an unspoken rule about the timing and manner of strategic disagreement within that particular organizational culture. The executive's career at the company never recovered from that initial misreading of social dynamics, despite their obvious competence and good intentions. The academic world provides particularly nuanced examples of this phenomenon. Doctoral students and junior faculty members often struggle to understand the complex web of intellectual alliances, methodological loyalties, and personal relationships that shape their departments. A graduate student who enthusiastically embraces a theoretical approach favored by one faculty member may inadvertently alienate others who view that approach as professionally or intellectually threatening. Their tongue, guided by genuine intellectual enthusiasm, creates political problems they never intended. Professional service environments, law firms, consulting companies, investment banks operate according to social hierarchies that combine formal rank with informal influence in ways that outsiders often misunderstand. The junior associate who speaks too casually to senior partners, offers unsolicited advice to clients, or fails to properly defer to more senior colleagues may find their career prospects diminished regardless of their technical competence. The tongue, operating according to democratic assumptions in fundamentally hierarchical environments, becomes an instrument of professional suicide. The phenomenon extends beyond workplace contexts into social and community environments where misreading group dynamics can lead to social isolation or conflict. The new neighbor who speaks too directly about community issues without understanding local history and relationships may find themselves excluded from informal networks that determine everything from business opportunities to social acceptance. Their tongue, guided by straightforward assumptions about communication, violates subtle protocols that govern community interaction. Machiavelli's insight was that effective communication requires understanding not just what you want to say, but how your audience is prepared to hear it within the context of existing relationships and power structures. The tongue, when operating without this understanding, often achieves the opposite of its intended effect. Attempts to build relationships create distance. Efforts to demonstrate competence reveal ignorance of crucial social protocols. The technology industry, with its complex mixture of technical meritocracy and social hierarchy, provides masterclasses in misread social dynamics. Engineers who assume that technical correctness trumps social sensitivity often find themselves marginalized despite their obvious competence. Entrepreneurs who fail to understand the intricate relationship networks that govern venture capital funding may present excellent business plans in ways that violate unspoken social expectations, destroying opportunities they never knew existed. The moment of false intimacy in the sophisticated courts of Renaissance Italy, the appearance of friendship often masked the reality of strategic alliance, and the appearance of enmity often concealed the reality of mutual dependence. Machiavelli observed how individuals would mistake professional courtesy for personal affection, strategic flattery for genuine admiration, and temporary alignment of interests for permanent loyalty. The tongue, when operating under these false assumptions of intimacy, would share information and express opinions that were appropriate for close friends but catastrophic when revealed to strategic competitors. The modern equivalent of this phenomenon pervades professional and social environments where the boundaries between personal and strategic relationships remain deliberately ambiguous. Corporate cultures that emphasize family atmospheres, political organizations that stress personal loyalty, and social networks that blur professional and personal connections all create contexts where false intimacy can flourish and ultimately betray those who mistake it for the genuine article. The psychology of false intimacy is rooted in humanity's fundamental need for connection and belonging. In professional environments that require long hours and intense collaboration, the line between colleague and friend naturally blurs. Shared challenges, mutual dependence, and regular interaction create bonds that feel personal even when they remain fundamentally professional. The tongue, guided by these feelings of connection, begins operating as if the relationship provides the safety and loyalty of true friendship. Corporate environments provide countless examples of false intimacy leading to professional disaster. Employees who mistake their manager's supportive demeanor for personal friendship often share information about their job search activities, personal financial pressures, or criticism of company policies that managers then use in performance evaluations or termination decisions. The supportive relationship that felt personal reveals itself to be fundamentally professional when interests diverge. The startup world offers particularly dramatic examples of false intimacy between founders and early employees. The intense collaboration required to build new companies from nothing creates bonds that feel like family relationships. Founders and employees work together for months or years under conditions of shared risk and mutual dependence. Yet when companies achieve success and face decisions about equity distribution, management restructuring, or strategic direction, these apparently personal relationships often reveal themselves to be fundamentally professional arrangements governed by economic rather than emotional considerations. Political environments, with their emphasis on personal loyalty and shared mission, create particularly fertile ground for false intimacy. Campaign workers who spend months traveling together, sharing hotel rooms, and working 18-hour days develop relationships that feel deeply personal. Yet when campaigns end and career opportunities arise, individuals often discover that their apparent friends view them primarily as professional contacts or potential competitors. Information shared under assumptions of personal loyalty becomes ammunition in professional conflicts. The venture capital and investment world operates according to particularly sophisticated versions of false intimacy. Investors cultivate relationships with entrepreneurs that feel personal and supportive, offering advice, making introductions, and providing encouragement that extends far beyond mere financial interest. Yet entrepreneurs who mistake these professional courtships for personal friendships often share strategic information or make business decisions based on assumed personal loyalty that does not actually exist when economic interests diverge. Machiavelli understood that in environments where personal and professional interests intersect, the wise individual maintains clear distinctions between strategic alliances and genuine friendships. The tongue, when guided by false assumptions about the nature of relationships, becomes remarkably generous with information that should be carefully protected. The phenomenon is particularly dangerous because false intimacy often involves people who genuinely like and respect each other within the boundaries of their professional relationship. The corporate manager who terminates an employee they genuinely enjoy working with may feel personal regret while making a professional decision based purely on business considerations. The investor who declines to fund an entrepreneur they personally admire may experience real disappointment while adhering to financial criteria that override personal feelings. Part 3: The Arsenal of Strategic Silence. The moment when silence becomes strategy. In the twilight years of the Florentine Republic, when every conversation carried the weight of potential exile and every silence might be interpreted as conspiracy, Machiavelli learned that words withheld often proved more powerful than words spoken. The strategic deployment of silence, knowing precisely when not to speak, became as crucial to survival as knowing what to say when speech was necessary. This understanding transforms silence from passive absence into active tool, capable of accomplishing objectives that direct communication could never achieve. The power of strategic silence lies in its ability to create space for others to project their own assumptions, fears, and desires onto the quiet individual. When carefully deployed, silence invites revelation rather than concealment, drawing information from others while preserving one's own position. The tongue, when properly restrained, becomes a fishing net that captures intelligence while revealing nothing in return. Consider the pharmaceutical executive facing questions about their company's response to unexpected trial results. Direct answers might provide legally actionable statements regardless of their accuracy. Defensive explanations might reveal strategic vulnerabilities. Yet carefully structured silence, I want to ensure I provide you with accurate information, so let me review the technical details and respond appropriately, creates space for questioners to reveal the scope and direction of their concerns while preserving maximum flexibility for future responses. The venture capital world has elevated strategic silence to an art form. Experienced investors have learned that entrepreneurs often reveal more crucial information during awkward pauses than during direct questioning. A simple statement like "tell me more about that," followed by patient silence, often produces detailed explanations of competitive threats, technical challenges, or market assumptions that direct questions might never uncover. The silence acts as a vacuum that draws out information that direct interrogation might cause entrepreneurs to protect. Corporate negotiation provides perhaps the most sophisticated examples of strategic silence as active communication tool. Experienced negotiators understand that the urge to fill conversational silence often overwhelms strategic thinking, causing opponents to make concessions or reveal information that they never intended to share. The negotiator who can remain comfortable with extended silence often finds that their counterparts, made uncomfortable by the quiet, begin offering additional terms or explanations that improve the final agreement. The legal profession offers masterclasses in the strategic deployment of silence during depositions and cross-examinations. Attorneys who ask pointed questions and, then, remain silent often find that witnesses, uncomfortable with the pause, continue talking beyond their intended answers. This additional information frequently proves more valuable than any response to the original question. The silence becomes a tool for encouraging self-incrimination that direct questioning might never achieve. Machiavelli's insight was that silence creates a form of psychological pressure that often proves more effective than verbal pressure. When faced with quiet from someone they expect to speak, individuals often experience anxiety that drives them to fill the void with information they would otherwise protect. The tongue, when properly restrained, becomes a catalyst for others' indiscretion. The technology industry provides contemporary examples of strategic silence in product development and competitive intelligence gathering. During industry conferences and networking events, experienced professionals often learn more about competitors' strategies through careful listening than through direct inquiry. A simple expression of interest followed by attentive silence often produces detailed explanations of technical approaches, market strategies, or partnership discussions that direct questions might cause competitors to deflect. Strategic silence also proves powerful in employment contexts where direct questions about salary expectations, career goals, or workplace preferences might create negotiating disadvantages. The candidate who responds to salary inquiries with "I'm sure you have a fair range in mind for this position," and then remains silent often discovers the employer's actual salary ceiling rather than anchoring negotiations around their own potentially conservative estimate. The phenomenon extends into social and community contexts where strategic silence can reveal social dynamics that direct questioning might never uncover. The new community member who listens carefully at local meetings often learns more about actual power structures, ongoing conflicts, and unspoken alliances than they could discover through months of direct inquiry. The silence becomes an anthropological tool for understanding social systems that participants might never explicitly describe. Yet strategic silence requires sophisticated judgment about timing and context. Silence that appears thoughtful in one situation may appear evasive or incompetent in another. The executive who remains strategically quiet during a crisis may be perceived as lacking leadership rather than demonstrating wisdom. The negotiator who uses silence effectively in private discussions may create suspicion or offense if they employ the same technique during public presentations. The moment of calculated confession, perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of Machiavellian communication strategy, involves the deliberate revelation of carefully selected vulnerabilities to achieve broader strategic objectives. In the complex political landscape of Renaissance Italy, where complete honesty was suicide and complete deception was unsustainable, the most sophisticated operators learned to manage perception through the calculated disclosure of specific weaknesses that served to obscure more significant strengths or conceal more dangerous liabilities. The psychology underlying calculated confession exploits fundamental assumptions about human honesty. When individuals voluntarily admit to flaws or failures, listeners typically assume they are experiencing comprehensive honesty rather than strategic disclosure. This assumption creates opportunities for managing perception through the careful selection of which truths to reveal and which to protect. Corporate crisis management provides sophisticated examples of calculated confession in action. When facing multiple potential scandals or regulatory challenges, experienced companies often choose to voluntarily disclose lesser violations to regulatory agencies, creating an impression of comprehensive cooperation while directing attention away from more serious potential liabilities. The confession of minor financial irregularities may satisfy regulatory curiosity while protecting against investigation of major strategic deceptions. The pharmaceutical industry has developed particularly nuanced approaches to calculated confession during drug approval processes. Companies facing questions about trial results often voluntarily disclose known minor side effects or limitations while emphasizing their transparency and commitment to safety. This calculated honesty satisfies regulatory requirements for disclosure while potentially preventing deeper investigation into more serious concerns that complete secrecy might provoke. Employment negotiations offer everyday examples of calculated confession. Job candidates who voluntarily acknowledge specific, correctable weaknesses often create impressions of self-awareness and honesty that obscure more serious professional limitations. The candidate who admits to being sometimes too detail-oriented or occasionally working too many hours provides information that feels like honest self-assessment while potentially preventing inquiry into more serious professional shortcomings. The venture capital world operates according to sophisticated versions of calculated confession. Entrepreneurs seeking funding often voluntarily acknowledge specific market challenges or competitive threats while positioning these admissions as evidence of their strategic sophistication and realistic market assessment. This selective honesty can build investor confidence while directing attention away from more fundamental business model problems that might prevent funding entirely. Legal strategy often involves calculated confession as a tool for managing jury perception and plea negotiations. Defense attorneys may encourage clients to acknowledge minor violations or poor judgment while maintaining innocence on major charges. The admission of lesser wrongs can create an impression of honesty and accountability that makes denial of more serious charges more credible. Machiavelli understood that credibility often depends less on complete honesty than on the strategic management of which truths to reveal and how to frame their significance. The tongue, when guided by calculated rather than compulsive honesty, becomes a tool for building trust while protecting essential interests. The technology sector provides contemporary examples of calculated confession in privacy and security discussions. Companies facing criticism for data collection practices often voluntarily disclose specific, limited uses of customer information while emphasizing their commitment to transparency. This selective disclosure can satisfy public concern while potentially preventing investigation into more extensive data usage that complete secrecy might invite. Political environments offer perhaps the most sophisticated examples of calculated confession. Politicians facing multiple potential scandals often choose to acknowledge lesser ethical lapses while maintaining innocence on more serious charges. The confession of minor campaign finance irregularities might satisfy media curiosity while directing attention away from more serious corruption allegations that complete denial might invite intensive investigation. The phenomenon extends into personal relationships where calculated confession can manage social dynamics and relationship expectations. Individuals who voluntarily acknowledge specific personal flaws often create impressions of self-awareness and emotional intelligence while potentially preventing partners or friends from discovering more serious personality traits that might damage relationships. Yet calculated confession requires extraordinary judgment about audience psychology and information management. Admissions that successfully manage one audience's perceptions may create unexpected vulnerabilities with other audiences who interpret the same information differently. The business executive who acknowledges strategic mistakes to build credibility with investors may find those same admissions quoted by competitors or regulators in contexts where they create legal or commercial liability. The moment of graceful retreat in the fluid political landscape of Renaissance Italy, where today's ally might become tomorrow's enemy and yesterday's enemy might become today's necessity, survival often depended less on winning every battle than on recognizing when strategic withdrawal preserved strength for future engagement. Machiavelli observed that the most successful political operators possessed an almost artistic sense of timing about when to abandon untenable positions while maintaining dignity and future options. The tongue, when properly directed, could transform apparent defeat into strategic repositioning. The psychology of graceful retreat runs counter to many deeply held beliefs about strength, persistence, and leadership. Contemporary culture often equates retreat with failure and persistence with virtue, creating pressure to continue defending positions long after they become strategically indefensible. Yet the most sophisticated practitioners of strategic communication understand that knowing when and how to withdraw can preserve credibility and create opportunities that stubborn defense would eliminate entirely. Corporate environments provide daily opportunities for graceful retreat as market conditions change, regulatory requirements evolve, and competitive landscapes shift. The executive who publicly advocated for a strategic direction that subsequent events prove unwise faces a choice between doubling down on failed strategy or finding elegant ways to acknowledge changed circumstances while preserving personal and organizational credibility. The tongue, properly deployed, can frame strategic pivots as evidence of adaptive intelligence rather than admissions of original error. Consider the technology company that invested heavily in a particular artificial intelligence approach only to discover that competitors had achieved superior results using different methodologies. Rather than defending their original technical choices or quietly abandoning their approach, the company's leadership publicly acknowledged the superior competitive solutions while repositioning their own research as valuable foundational work that enabled them to recognize and adopt better approaches more quickly than they could have developed them independently. The pharmaceutical industry offers particularly complex examples of graceful retreat as clinical trials produce unexpected results and regulatory requirements change. Companies that have invested years and hundreds of millions of dollars in particular drug development programs sometimes discover that continuation would be strategically catastrophic regardless of the sunk costs involved. The tongue, when properly directed, can frame program termination as evidence of rigorous scientific standards and responsible resource allocation rather than acknowledgement of failed strategy. Political environments provide masterclasses in graceful retreat as policy positions that seemed viable during campaign seasons prove unworkable when confronted with governing realities. Politicians who can acknowledge changed circumstances without appearing to abandon core principles often maintain credibility that enables them to be effective advocates for modified approaches. The alternative, stubborn defense of untenable positions often results in political irrelevance as events move beyond their ability to influence outcomes. Machiavelli's insight was that retreat, when properly executed, often preserves more strategic options than victory achieved at excessive cost. The tongue, when guided by strategic rather than ego-driven considerations, can transform apparent defeat into foundation for future success. The venture capital world operates according to sophisticated versions of graceful retreat as market conditions change and investment theses prove incorrect. Investors who can acknowledge changed market dynamics while repositioning their expertise for new opportunities often maintain credibility with entrepreneurs and limited partners that enables them to participate in future investment cycles. The alternative, stubborn defense of failed investment strategies often results in permanent loss of market credibility. Legal strategy often requires graceful retreat as discovery processes reveal information that undermines originally planned defenses and settlement negotiations provide better outcomes than continued litigation. Attorneys who can acknowledge changed circumstances while repositioning their clients' interests often achieve better outcomes than those who persist with strategies that events have made untenable. The phenomenon extends into academic and intellectual contexts where research discoveries sometimes undermine theoretical frameworks that scholars have spent careers developing. The researcher who can acknowledge new evidence while repositioning their expertise often maintains academic credibility that enables continued contribution to their field. The alternative, stubborn defense of theories that evidence has discredited often results in intellectual irrelevance as the field moves beyond their ability to contribute meaningfully. Yet graceful retreat requires sophisticated judgment about timing, framing, and audience psychology. Withdrawal that appears strategic to one audience may appear weak or inconsistent to another. The business leader who gracefully abandons a failed strategy may build credibility with investors while potentially undermining employee confidence in leadership consistency. In the final analysis, Machiavelli's observations about the destructive power of the unbridled tongue remain as relevant in our age of instant communication and permanent documentation as they were in the shadow of the Medici palaces. The 10 moments examined here, premature victory declarations, defensive revelations, misplaced trust, emotional flooding, boastful expertise, vindictive truth-telling, misread social dynamics, false intimacy, strategic silence, calculated confession, and graceful retreat represent recurring patterns of human behavior that transcend historical period and cultural context. The modern practitioner of strategic communication operates in an environment that Machiavelli could hardly have imagined, where words spoken in private can become public within minutes, where casual conversations are recorded and archived indefinitely, and where the consequences of linguistic missteps can reverberate across global networks with devastating speed. Yet the fundamental principles he identified, the need to match communication strategy to circumstances, the importance of understanding audience psychology, the value of timing and discretion, remain the foundation of effective human interaction. Perhaps most importantly, Machiavelli understood that the greatest danger to strategic communication comes not from external enemies but from internal impulses, the desire to be understood, the need to defend our dignity, the impulse to demonstrate our expertise, the urge to punish those who wrong us. The tongue becomes our enemy precisely because it feels like our ally, promising to serve our interests while often betraying them. The path forward requires neither cynicism nor manipulation, but rather the development of what might be called linguistic wisdom, the ability to recognize when speech serves our deeper interests and when silence provides better protection for our authentic selves and genuine objectives. In a world where the consequences of communication have never been higher, the ability to think before we speak, to pause before we react, and to retreat before we overcommit may prove to be the most valuable skills we can develop. The tongue will always be a dangerous servant and a terrible master. The choice, as Machiavelli knew, remains eternally ours.